Welcome back. This is week 5, lecture 1, social conditions and the crumbling of feudal structures. And what we've been talking about up until this lecture, in some ways, in terms of the emergence and development of early modern Europe out of medieval Christendom and the crumbling of medieval Christendom, which I talked about in the first part of the course as the background. And then with what historians have called early modern Europe, we begin to see developments that make it very easy to consider this period a time of continued progress. We have the emergence of the nation state, the breaking up of this concept of Christendom under the emperor and the pope, to individual nation states, to the idea that humans can increasingly begin to think for themselves, which they always had done, but that, and I've talked about that in previous lectures, but the issue is this sense of we're doing something new. This is a new attitude is emerging, and how wonderful it is, because just look at what we have accomplished, especially then with the scientific revolution and on into the Enlightenment. We can look back on this period and see it as, again, one of progress. And that has certainly been one dominant view of history. That history in the West, in any case, has been an ongoing progress towards betterment. We're progressing, and not in terms of simply processing, but progressing to a better and better society and world. In some ways, that's called the Whig interpretation of history, which was the 16th and 17th century, or 17th and 18th century English understanding based on the Whigs, the political party of the Whigs. That we're always getting better. And then, of course, as I talked about in the last lecture with Leibniz, we have this idea that this is the best of all possible worlds, but that just then keeps going. It just keeps becoming better and better. And yet, that is an illusion. That is maybe looking at simply one or two aspects and dynamics of culture, and is not looking at the whole society as such. Jacques Le Goff, a very famous French medievalist, talked about the long Middle Ages. So, with the long Middle Ages, for the majority of the population in Europe, for even the vast majority of the population in Europe, life in 1300 was not all that different from life in 1700 or even in 1750. The changes were not all that great for the rural population, for the poor. Now, we'll be talking about some of these changes that were coming about, that were different from the medieval view, certainly. But I think Le Goff has a point. That if we look at these cultural, intellectual developments, we have to ask who reaped the benefit? And was it not simply a very small class of elite people who saw it in these terms? And that for society as such, life was still pretty miserable. There were still plagues, there were still wars, there was still hunger and disease and misery. Life in medieval Europe, or in early modern Europe, for the vast majority of the population was not one of, isn't this fantastic and wonderful? We are, in continuing to increase and continuing to get better, and we're so happy to be living at this time. It was, as in some ways always had been, a life of drudgery and misery, which is not to say that there wasn't any concept of individuality, because there certainly was, and didn't mean to say that people couldn't be happy. You can be happy within miserable conditions. You can find things to be happy. And peasant life was always that way. They had their celebrations and everything else, and their festivities. But overall, it was hard. Life was hard. And in some ways, we can say it still is. Now, certainly, I'm not trying to say that we are no better off, so to speak, than we were in 1650 or 1750. Things have changed, but is that an evaluative, progressive change, or is it simply a change? How do we put it all together? How do we understand what was going on? Now, changes there were. We'll be talking about some of those things, but in this lecture, I want to give some brief insights. And I mean brief because we could spend all semester and then some on the topics I'll be talking about today, or some of them anyway. And some of these are discussed in more detail in your book. I'll be giving probably more details than I don't think are presented in your textbook. And so it is trying to fill out the picture, so to speak. If we only look at the achievements of the intelligentsia, we get a very different picture than when we look at society as a whole, the social structures and what was going on, which too, though, is changing. It still was an issue of where do we really fit? How do we come to a new understanding of our place in society? And what seemingly had been clear in medieval Christendom in terms of, okay, I'm a peasant, meaning I'm not a nobleman, I'm not part of the clergy, I work on the land. I have my own, as such, I have my rights and privileges. And I know where I fit within the world. I know how I'm supposed to act, what my duties and responsibilities are. I accept those, and there we go. Increasingly coming out of the medieval world on into the Reformation, age of confessionalization, the dawn of early modern Europe, that sense of where I fit was falling apart, except for the top level echelons, or maybe also the bottom level. Slaves were still slaves. And it leads to an increasing anxiety and or not really the anxiety, but a feeling of being unsettled. There's turmoil. There's a lack of understanding of how things are really working. I talk about the change of paradigms and how Newton established a new paradigm that makes sense and is valid for cosmology, for our understanding of the universe and how it really worked on an intellectual level. And it had implications for theology and everything else. And philosophy, of course. And literature, of course. But what was the experience of the quote unquote common person? And what difference did Newton make, for example? Or what difference did Voltaire make for the common person? And we could argue that really didn't really have much of an effect at all. I mean, it did. We'll be talking about that. But there were structural changes that did affect all of society. And we'll be looking at some of those today as we go through the lecture on, in some ways, putting early modern Europe in the social context, at least to an extent. So that being said, in terms of the context of what this is all about, as we're looking towards your first midterm, which I'll be talking about in the second lecture for this week, preparing for the midterm, which I'll be addressing that explicitly. This is kind of a culmination of this first part of the course. We need to see what we've been talking about, how that really fits and leads up to this point, not necessarily of culmination and new beginnings, but a point of stopping and reflecting on where we have what we have seen and where we have come. How did we get to this point, and what did it mean for common people? What were some of the structural changes that were going on that maybe were not even recognized at the time? That's what we're looking at today, at least in brief, at least with some impression and examples to indicate more significant changes. And what I want you to think about is, how do we evaluate society and culture? How do we evaluate these chronological periods? What does it mean for people? And if we say, what does it mean? Don't we always have to ask the question, for whom? And how does that relate to our society today and our understanding of our world today? What does it mean? Where do we fit? And on we go. Anyway, that being said, I begin by going back to what I had talked about within medieval Christendom and some of the basic structures of medieval Christendom and its divisions of society. And I have up here the first slide from orders to classes, because I think I've gone over the three orders. And I have up here the three estates with the three orders. And I mentioned that that was not going to change until the French Revolution, at least in France. The three orders, and that term ordo, had many different meanings. It was, in some ways, could be the most important Latin word for understanding the entire Middle Ages. I mean, I'm just throwing that out there, and I would have to think about it a bit more. But I think I could certainly defend that the Latin term ordo is the single most important word for understanding medieval Christendom. But anyway, that being said, the three orders, as they were codified in law in the 12th century, were those who worked, those who prayed, and those who fought. Or actually, in the opposite order. Those who fought were the nobility, those who prayed or the clergy, and those who worked or the peasantry. Now, it was never quite that simple, because there was a whole different range within each of those orders. And everything from the emperor, the king of France, the king of England, that upper level nobility in terms of those who fight, to lower level individual knights who you could not be equated with the upper nobility. So even that quote unquote order or group was very diverse and many tiered and layered. The same thing for the clergy. Your simple parish priest was very different from a bishop or an archbishop or the pope, both in terms of understanding and knowledge, education, but also in terms of what their actual daily life was like. And the same thing for the peasantry. The peasantry were not simply peasants who lived on a farm and worked the land as we commonly think of being a peasant, but there were classes of peasants. Now, the term class, which I'll be talking a little bit more about in a minute, is really a term that emerged in the 19th century with Marx and Engels in terms of different classes of society. And so it is anachronistic in some ways to use the term class to refer to pre-19th century Europe. And yet, in a more, or let's say in a less technical sense, class simply as a group or a designation helps. And one of my professors in graduate school wrote a book on peasant classes in Germany in the 16th, 17th century and on from there. Because what he showed was that there were multiple layers of peasant classes, from actually very wealthy peasants to almost enslaved peasants, the serfs who would be very poor, not have much of anything, to peasants who were almost as wealthy, if not more wealthy, than some of the lower nobility. That really then also caused a problem with when we had the rise of the merchant class, because the merchants didn't really fit within that medieval construct of the three orders, nor did the bankers on those different levels. And so it's far more complex than simply the nobility, the clergy, and the peasantry, even though those were legal definitions and classifications. What were excluded from all of that, besides looking at all the problems of the classification itself, were women, slaves, children, and Jews. They said, well, Jews were part of the classes, yes, but they were still seen as other. Women were seen as other. Children were seen as other. Now, women were very important, and children were very important, from the peasant families to the nobilities. They had a role and a function. And then, of course, in the 16th century, we had these great female monarchs. Elizabeth I and Catherine de Medici she was a queen, so I guess not really a monarch, because she was either the queen of Henry II and then the regent queen mother, the regent queen with her children after Henry was killed. But these amazing female rulers, and the impact of the nobility, the female nobility, was huge. And yet still they were seen as other. They were not really part of society. We say, well, this is a male-dominated world. Yes, it was. Yes, it was. And the history of it has also been male dominated. We just have to keep that in mind when we're looking at how history is being represented and portrayed and plotted, that it could be a very different perspective and a very different story if we focused on women, or if we focused on children, if we focused on slavery. And just think about these different worlds, and the same applies to us today, in our society today. The experience of women is very different from the experience of men. The experience of someone who lives in Geist or in the Meridian Kessler area is completely different from someone who lives, on Keystone and 20th. It's like, how do we describe even Indianapolis in 2024? Because of that diversity that was there or is there. And can that be reduced to a single storyline? And on what basis is that single storyline being written? Or are there so many different storylines that to come up with one overall picture is impossible? Or at least it warps it. Now, that is the struggle that we have with early modern Europe. In some ways, the struggle was with the historians face with whatever society we're looking at, because also we know so little. The amount of information, I'll be talking about this shortly, is increasing in early modern Europe. So we know far more about European society and culture on all levels in 1700 than we did about European society and culture in 1500. It makes it a little bit easier, but also then more difficult. Now, if we look at how this structure of the three orders is changing, I'm just going to look at all those people who were classified as the peasantry, the third order. Because here I have those who worked, increasingly consisted of different classes. Now, this is not quite right, because if you look at the slide here, from orders to classes, I have that underneath those who worked in the very end, nobles. That gets to the upper classes. But when we look at the lower classes, it's not simply a unified whole. I already talked about the peasant classes, the rural agricultural labor. Those could be, as I've already said and indicated, very diverse, from fairly well-off peasants to extremely poor peasants. And then again, these are two terms coming up from Marx: proletariat, the urban workers and labor. The labor, people who work, the workers who produce the wealth. And we'll be talking more about urbanization in the next slide or so. But we have a new kind of class of people who are working in the cities, not on the land, but in the cities, producing wealth for those people who are making money because they're hiring laborers to work to help make the money. And then we have the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie, the French term for burghers, it just means citizens. It comprises the merchants and the bankers and the kind of what having the wealthy peasant classes in terms of those that did not fit within that concept and order of the peasantry, become their own thing, the bourgeois. We still talk about the bourgeoisie in some fashions. We'll be talking more about that certainly after this midterm. So I'm kind of feeding forward, so to speak, in this case. But it's important to keep in mind, and we can think of it in these terms: the emerging bourgeoisie as an important factor, demographic factor, social factor, cultural factor in early modern Europe. Now, I already said the merchants and bankers have been important in medieval Christendom too, but they become not only the growth of that class, but also the importance of it. And with the proletariat, you see, okay, does it include agricultural workers? Well, yes, but it predominantly looks at urban workers. And the growth of the cities, as I'll be talking about shortly, was something that was expanding greatly. So we have this increasing class, or just simply numbers of people who are expanding and coming to what Marx would call a class consciousness, even though not quite yet, but we'll get there when we get there. But a realization that we are not the same as those people we work for. We're not the same as the people, from where we came, basically living in the farm in the countryside. We're not rural agricultural workers. We are urban workers. And they too could be relatively comfortable to extremely poor and miserable and barely able to live. So these different classes become problematic. And then we have kind of from the peasant classes to the proletariat to the bourgeoisie, the new aristocracy, the gentry, the lower nobility as emerging as a distinct kind of class for understanding. The gentry, whether they were noble or not, were, let's say, those wealthy merchants and bankers who were able then to have the leisure to have, as we'll see in England, country homes and estates, who didn't necessarily have to partake, didn't have to work for their own wealth, who could simply hire wealth out. And we have the gentry as the kind of the lower level, and we have the lower nobility, who were sometimes really squeezed for wealth because they had this standard of living they were supposed to be upholding. They couldn't always afford it. So that is a tension there too. And we see that already in the 16th century with the lower nobility. And then we have the upper nobility. Now, if you're part of the upper nobility, in part of the royal family or associated with it or near it, if you're one of the great dukes or counts or great princes, I'm not saying that you have an easy life, but you have a means of subsistence, a means of life that very few others ever have. And that just continues. The upper nobility remained the upper nobility, the wealthy, the elite. Now, one of the interesting things, those were traditionally in medieval Christendom referred to as those who fight the nobility. Yet, as we've seen and talked about with the standing armies, the new standing armies, both with Louis XIV and then with Cromwell in England, all of a sudden we have the professionalization of the military, and so that the nobility can no longer really accurately be defined as those who fight. They're simply very wealthy, powerful people who govern. If you just think about Parliament in England even today, two houses of Parliament in England, the House of Lords, or the nobles, the House of Commons, everybody else, comprised of prominently the gentry, the lower aristocracy, the gentry, and the bourgeoisie. So that division is still there. And they lived in different worlds, as they did also as the bourgeoisie and the gentry and the bourgeoisie, lived in different worlds from the serfs, the peasants, the slaves. Because we're still talking about a slave economy, but a society that used slaves in early modern Europe. Yes, and going on to the 18th century, we begin to see in the later 18th century the doing away and banning of the slave trade. The slaves were there, the profits had been made, people had become very, very wealthy from it. And that spreads. Talking again more about all of this after the midterm. This is one example. An Englishman by the name of Elihu Yale had made a fortune in the colonies and came to the New World and established a college, Yale College. So all of these benefactors, European nobility, aristocracy that had become extremely wealthy based on the new slave economies and colonialization, spread that to the New World as well. So there's a very direct connection to what was going on in Europe and what was happening here in what we now call the United States. that's not really our complete focus. Anyway, um, okay, so that is what we're looking at. And so the society is changing. Society is changing on all levels, from the upper nobility to the gentry, to the lower nobility, to the gentry, to the aristocracy. Aristocracy consisting of the nobles and the bourgeoisie, to the merchants. We can say, well, is it diversifying? Well, in some ways, yes. In some ways, no, because it was never so simple as those three orders might give the impression that it was. There was always various levels, but all of a sudden it becomes more problematic, and there's more tensions, and there are more different classes that are recognized, and distinctions in fighting, and it becomes a real social problem. We have social conflict and upsetness today. That's just the inheritance we have from our early modern forebears. One of the segments of society that really didn't change too much was really the poor. The poor you will always have with you, said Jesus. And that has certainly been the case. And as we look to this next slide, let's look at the poor, the real poor, which included both the urban poor and the rural poor. And in some ways, depending on where we draw the line, can be seen as consisting of the majority of the population, defining how we define poor. If we did say, okay, subsistence, if you have enough simply to survive or less than. At what point does, what point is that poverty level? We still have that term today, the poverty level. What percentage of our population lives beneath the poverty level? And I think it would astound you to realize the extent of poverty, even in the United States. Whereas early modern Europe is a larger faction. If we look at that slide, we see that we have the haves and the have-nots, and maybe that is the best way to distinguish the quote-unquote rich and the poor. The rich are those who have, and the poor are those who do not have. And just some statistics here in France and England, in early modern Europe, the top 10% of the population owned 90% of the national wealth, and the top 1% owned 60% of the national wealth. Now, I don't know exactly the statistics today, but that wealth gap between the haves and the have-nots, that upper 10% and then upper 1% in the United States has simply gotten bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So I think I'd have to look this up. I know I've seen statistics, I've read about it, but it's at least as much of a discrepancy in early modern today as it was in early modern Europe. So the upper 10%, upper 1%. That does not make for social cohesion. And when you have so many poor people, the problem is what to do about it. How do we handle the poor? It's interesting because in medieval Europe, the poor served a societal function. They were the people who received alms. And receiving alms was seen as a good work, a virtue, something that you did to help in that religious context. With the Reformation, especially with the Calvinists, and when I think I talked about when I talked about Calvin, the perversion of Calvinism and what became known as the Protestant work ethic, this sense of poor became not a sense of charity, an understanding of Christian charity in society, but rather an issue of moral guilt. If you're poor, it's your fault. You're lazy. You don't work hard enough. That attitude is still very prevalent in this country today. The idea that you can simply pull yourself up by your bootstraps if you can and get out there and make a good, decent living, if not become wealthy yourself. That idea is such a myth and in the sense of complete falsehood. It's such an illusion. But that became what was kind of seen at times as the poor problem, or the problem of the poor. What do we do about them? Do we help them? Do we just say it's all their fault? They're not worth being helped? I think I mentioned with the slave issue, the question was, are these fully human? The slavery. Are the slaves fully human beings? Because if they're fully human, as some of the good Dutch slave traders argued and questioned and worried about, then we have a problem. Because if they're fully human, they were created in the image and likeness of God, just as we are. And then how can we treat them this way? Same thing with the poor. How can we allow them to live in such squalor and such poor conditions? Shouldn't we help them? Well, not if it's their own fault. Not if we see them as a drag on society. The problem is the poor made up the majority of the population. And that did not change with the population growth. And in some ways, the poor just became a larger segment of the population, again, depending on how we define the poor. We look at population growth. We see that in the 16th century, population had recovered to pre-1347 levels, the years in the year 1347 when the Black Death hit, the plague, which decimated the population of Europe. There had been steady population growth simply, and then we had the famine in northern Europe, and then we had the plague, and then it plummeted, at least by over a third. It's not until approximately the 16th century, in the course of the 16th century, that the population recovered in terms of that pre-1347 years. Then during the 16th and then on into the 17th century, there is growth, but there's also stagnation, and it is kind of not always clear what the overall trends are, even though we can say from the mid-18th century, there's increasing steady growth in population. Now here, just have some statistics put up here. London, for example, in early 16th century was approximately 60,000 people. By 1700, it had grown to 500,000. And you can say, wow, that is amazing growth. And it is amazing growth. And I'll be addressing that in a second as well. Paris, you can see in the early 16th century, was approximately had a population of 200,000. And by 1700, was also close to 500,000. Also a huge increase. All the while, the rural population remained stagnant. We see this process of urbanization, where the new population growth is based on the move to the cities, whereas the rural agricultural production, which still the economy was based on agriculture, was based on the agricultural rural production. When population increases, there's a limit in some ways to how many farm workers you really need. So there was an influx into the cities. So the real population growth were in the cities, which leads to all kinds of problems in terms of people being out of work, not having work, the increasing poor. The upper nobility and the aristocracy, they're not really increasing in population that much. It are the working classes. It is the bourgeoisie who are feeling wealthy, so they have more and more children and then provide for them. It is the laborers who are there, who can no longer work on the farms and come into the cities. And with that population, especially the huge increase we saw there in London, we have disease, we have hunger, we have all kinds of problems, we have slums. We have poor houses. We have poor laws being established. And we have poor prisons where being poor became a crime if you could not pay your debts. It was a real social problem, and one that the upper classes didn't want to have to think about. And yet became an increasing problem as that segment of the population was swelling in terms of growth. What do we do about it? How do we handle it? And in some ways, that became a major problem for early modern Europe, and then thereafter as well, as we will see after the midterm. What do we do with the increasing population of the poor as population increasingly rises, the percentage of the poor increases as well. I would like to be able to say, with in a correlated fashion. I can't say that because I don't have the statistics. I have to go back and look them up and see. I'll be addressing some of these problems more after the midterm. So this is still, in some ways, feeding forward, so to speak, looking towards the era of revolutions and the Industrial Revolution and what that really meant as we go on into the next segment of this course. But at this point, I just want you to be aware that this is all developing and emerging. These problems are being made known and being made conscious of what do we do about this and how do we handle it as a society. And that's a problem and an issue, especially as during this period, education and information is spreading. Talked about the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, and I said at the beginning this was for developments for the elite and but the ideas spread further in various ways, and did so also through print. I don't think I mentioned this explicitly when I talked about the Reformation, but it really was too a revolution in printing. The printing press had been developed by Gutenberg in 1455, was the first 42-line Bible. But printing took a while to take off, and it was only with Luther that printing became a major issue. And we started having, there all had been book fairs for a long time, but then the number of publications started to expand, and different types of publication. Something called the Flugschriften. These cheaply produced publications designed for mass distribution, called pamphlets, which can be everything from 1 or 2 pages to 200 pages or so was the definition of a pamphlet, but for widespread distribution. That doesn't mean that everybody could read, because they certainly couldn't, but then they would be read too. And so information and ideas were getting out there. And increasingly so as we move on into the 17th century and 18th century, just the growth and the popularization of information. And with that, too, came the growth of schooling, whereby it became seen as a need for education, at least for an elementary education. And we see that within the Reformation in terms of the catechetical endeavor, the attempt to teach what was needed to know for salvation, spread to the idea of, and we should teach our people anyway, because ignorance will lead to heresy. So if we can teach them not just what to believe and what to, how to learn the catechism, but if we can teach them more broadly, we can prevent heresy. And that was the idea for the Protestants and for the Catholics all the way through. So the concept of education and the importance of it became far more important as we move into this 17th and on into the 18th century, and far more widespread. And just as one example, here in the Duchy of Württemberg in 1520, there were 89 schools. And here we're talking about not universities, we're talking about lower level schools. But by 1600, there were over 400. And that just shows that the need for education was growing. Still, by and large, people were homeschooled. They didn't go to an institution. There was no requirement for public education. There was no there's a term that we use today, where you have to go to school up to a certain age. That did not exist, but they had these elementary schools and grammar schools to teach basic things, because also as the artisan class, as the bourgeoisie is emerging, as the urbanization is taking off, you need to have some basic level of education to function within an urban environment for the most part. So that's part of this development as well. which leads into the issue of literacy, because that is one of the basics. You can't read a pamphlet. You can't read, as I'll mention in a moment, newspapers if you don't know how to read. You have to rely on someone reading them to you. Defining and identifying literary rates is very difficult because what consists of being literate? In the Middle Ages, the concept of being literate meant that you were that you could function in Latin, spoken and written Latin. All education was done in Latin. Universities was all in Latin, and then increasingly Greek was added to that because the literate man was the educated man, the literati. In the 17th century, it became the term the literati, or the well-educated. But you knew Latin, you knew Greek, and then north of the Alps, as I mentioned, I think before, Hebrew as well became an important understanding. So the illiterate, the illiterati, or the idiote, as they were called, the idiots, were those who didn't know Latin. And I'm not just talking about being able to say the responses to the Mass in Latin. I'm talking about being able to write in Latin, read in Latin, speak and converse in Latin. If you couldn't do that, you were not educated. Now that was a very small segment of the population. And even in the 17th century, it was no more than 1 to 2% of the population were literate in terms of that. But increasingly, too, as a result of, first of all, the Renaissance, when the vernacular starts being used more and more, and then the Reformation, when the vernacular becomes being used more and more, it's difficult to say that someone is illiterate if they can read and write French, or if they can read and write German, or if they can read and write English, even though if they can't read and write Latin. So literacy statistics are problematic because it's like, what are they based on? And then also, what is the evidence we have for who is literate and who isn't? And that's where we get this increasing bureaucratization coming out of the confessionalization, as I talked about it, confessionalism, the confessionalization process in the 16th century, and the bureaucratization thereof, because we starts getting things of baptismal records, we start getting things of parish records, we start getting things as marriage registers. So if you want to marry someone, you have to go and sign your name to a register. And on some of these aspects, we can tell who can sign and who cannot. And here I have literacy rates, some statistics, and again, I said, these are based on the sources that are available, and not based on whether they could read Latin. I have up there, 1 to 2% were literate in Latin. But what you see up here, in Denmark, peasants, that broad category of peasants, in 1720, 80% of the peasantry could not sign their name. Now you say, how do we know that? Yeah, based on parish records, they have an X, they couldn't really sign their name. And so this is an impression. It's an approximation based on the sources we have, and in some ways, it's the best we can do. But by 1800, only 10% could not sign their name. So there was an increase in literacy, if we can say literacy as being the ability to sign your own name, a huge increase in literacy between 1720 and 1800 in Denmark. In London and Paris, by 1750, approximately by mid-18th century, over 90% of the males were literate in terms of being able to sign their names, read, write. On we go. In Amsterdam in 1620, 33% of grooms, men getting married, could not sign their name to the bridal register. 67% of brides could not. So there's also the gender discrepancy. A third of the males in Amsterdam in 1620 were quote unquote illiterate in terms of they couldn't write their name, sign their name. But 2/3 of the females were, of the brides were. But by 1680 and 1780, that had the literacy increased, the illiteracy had declined. Only 15% of grooms could not sign their name, down from 33%, and only 36% of brides, down from 67%, could not sign. So the literacy is increasing based on being able to sign your name in the bridal register or the marriage registers. In England, also based on baptismal records and court records, approximately 1530, or in 1530, approximately 30% of the gentry were literate. In 1600, less than 1% of the gentry were illiterate, meaning could not read or write or sign their names. In 1600, less than or more than 90% of the day laborers were illiterate. And what does that mean? That points to this discrepancy of education between the day laborers, where over 90% were illiterate. They could not read or write. Whereas with the gentry, that new kind of emerging class of the shopkeepers, the bankers, they're not noble, but they're wealthy. They are producing the wealth. They're hiring people. Those people who control what Marx will call control the means of production. The gentry, less than 1% were illiterate, whereas the workers, more than 90% were illiterate. And we'll see that tension as we go through there. Now, in this overarching structure within Europe, we also see the shift from Latin to French as being the basis for international diplomacy, for what is generally expected. Maybe I speak, I'm German, but if I want to speak to someone in Spain, I'll speak French. Someone in Spain can speak French, so we can speak to each other because I can't speak Spanish, and someone in Spain can't speak German. So we see the emergence of the lingua franca, the French language, as the standard, beginning to replace Latin as the standard. Because all of a sudden, within this more bourgeois, gentrified culture and economy, when only a very, very small percent thereof knew Latin in terms of being able actually to function in it. I'm sure they a lot more new phrases and terms and things like that. But in terms of actually being able to function in Latin, this shifted into French. And why? Well, at this time, the 17th century, 18th century is really when France, under the Louis XIV especially, is exerting its influence not only militarily and politically, but also culturally all across Europe. So it becomes kind of a thing to be French, and the Frenchification of Europe we can see at this time as the model of Louis XIV. Even Peter the Great in Prussia copies Louis XIV in Versailles, in Sanssouci, outside of Berlin. Frederick the Great established this castle. It's modeled after Versailles and Louis XIV. Now, lingua franca just means in Latin the French language, or the language of the Franks, or whatever. But it means to be that which is common. So now we would say today that English is the lingua franca, that Latin had been the lingua franca in that general sense, even though what it really refers to is this emerging use of French for international diplomacy in the standard basic language, the way English is today. So we go from Latin to French and then eventually to English as the lingua franca. Now, that does not mean that everybody still knew French. Local dialects still remain of immense importance. In Wales, we see up there in 1800, 70% of people living in Wales, they knew no English. They only knew Welsh. France, 1790, the population was approximately 28 million. 21.43% could not read or write or speak. I have it there, or speech. My apologies. Cannot read, write, or speak French. It was the local dialect. And 6 million, approximately, or the same percentage, could understand French but could not speak it correctly. So we have 12 million out of the 28 million who are not really literate in the lingua franca. Now, I don't know if you have ever, if any of you have lived for extended periods of times um, in a foreign country. By that I mean whatever your mother tongue is, somewhere else. Especially in Europe, there are dialects. I mean, when I first went to the Netherlands up in Groningen, um, I learned Dutch and I got pretty rather fluent in Dutch. I could lecture in Dutch, for example. But the local dialect was called Gronings. I could not understand a single word. Or even there's another one, Frisian. Um, I could not understand a single word. So I'd go to the marketplace, the Grote Markt, um, on Saturdays, and all the merchants are there, and try to. I could speak Dutch. I could understand Dutch, but I could not get their dialect. That was what we're talking about here. It's not just an accent, but if you think about it, there are accents in areas in the United States where even though they're speaking English and you're speaking English, if you go there, it's going to be very difficult to understand. What? Because of the accent. And then if a dialect is even different because it's almost a different language, even though it's in the same language group. That's what we're really getting at. And whether or not you can communicate, that's what this is about. If French as the lingua franca, if you only speak patois, you're not going to be able to participate in international society or even beyond your local level. Or the same thing with Welsh. If all you can do is speak Welsh, you're not going to be able to participate. That is what was at issue. And yet, nevertheless, literacy is expanding. The ability to read and write than it had been a century or two before. And with that comes the growth in publications, just the sheer number of publications, the amount of information that is being spread out there. We talk about today the information technology, the information revolution. This is the information age. Well, there was an information age already in early modern Europe when printing is developed and then spreads, and with the Reformation really takes off, and then increasingly into the 16th, 17th century, 18th century, increasingly spreads, and we start getting our first newspapers. Talked about the Flugschriften, the pamphlets that were designed for wide distribution. Well, newspapers were designed for wide distribution as well. So it's not just referred to, designed for the aristocracy or the nobility. It's designed for anybody who can read and write, and relatively inexpensive. It's not going to be the poor, the poorest are not going to be able to buy the newspapers, but they're available. They're there. They can be seen, and also they can be read too. And so that idea of the spread of information, of what's going on, the reporting, the ideas that are spreading around, all of a sudden start becoming to be far more diffuse within society or spread within society. It's not just the elite. Now, there was the emergence of all of these different classes of people. There's really the emergence of the intellectuals as a class, the educated, university educated, trained, who saw themselves as such. But that is increasing. The idea that we can all learn things. Then with that too comes the problem of the dissemination. Because if I hear a new idea about something, do I understand it in the same level that it's meant? We have the same problem today in terms of specialized expertise and knowledge, and then the popular knowledge. What's the difference? What is the discrepancy between what's popularly known and what the experts in the field say? That is a problem that is still here with us today, and that was there in early modern Europe with this spread of information and with the spread of newspapers and things. What does it all mean? Now we have up there statistics of first newspapers. Germany was 1605, Netherlands 1618, France 1631, and England 1702. But ideas are spreading by these means, and information is spreading, and people are talking about them. And with that, too, comes more of the establishments of societies and salons. I have up there royal societies. We have the academies that are being founded, the royal academies in France and in the Empire, in Prussia, in England. Academy of Sciences, Academy of Arts. Um, these are non-university academic institutions, become very prestigious, and so they're nationally supported. We still have our National Institute or Academy or the National Endowment of the Humanities and National Endowment of the Sciences, National Science Foundation, non-university support and structures for intellectual scientific pursuits. That's an important part of it. Now, the salons are more local, often led by aristocratic women, having people over and talking about it. It gave them a means of talking about the new ideas that was not being within the public realm. But the men also came to the salons, especially this is in French. Also, the coffee houses. Get together at a coffee house and start talking about what was printed in the latest paper about what Diderot was saying on the Encyclopédie or something like that. It is really an intellectual culture. Ideas are spreading at a rate that they had never done before. Now, the coffee houses are really interesting because in 1500 there were no coffee houses. It's a matter of trade, of export and import. And the same thing with tea. We know today the British are famous for drinking tea all the time. There was no tea in England in 1400. It was a commodity that was brought in. And so we see this changing of society based on what Wallerstein referred to as the world system, this enriching of the core, according to Wallerstein, of 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 the European nations who are enriching themselves by means of the trade of their colonialization, what was called the triangular trade, which included then slave labor and the colonies. So it's the colonial expansion enriching Europeans that led to and made possible this growth of ideas that led to the critiquing of the system itself. Why should we maybe have slavery? Why should we have colonies? Isn't that kind of wrong? Why should we sit and be told that we just have to shut up and do our job? Shouldn't we try to make things better for ourselves? Don't we have rights not based on our order, but because we're here? We're individuals. We heard Mr. Locke say that we have that all men have the right to life, liberty, and property. Well, I don't have any property, so I should get property. My life isn't very good, so I should get a better one. And I'm not really free because I am shackled with, a lack of means. What does all that mean? I can, should assert my own rights. And it wasn't so clear. This idea of rights based on orders now was shifting, as I've already said, intellectually, theoretically, to rights based on individuals that was based on the emerging diversity of classes within society that could no longer appeal to their rights as an order, but had to almost appeal to their individual rights, even if they understood them differently than Locke had intended them. Just as in the Peasants' War of 1525, the peasants appealed to Luther in his writings about the freedom of a Christian, and Luther said, no, 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 that's not what I meant at all. I don't mean, social freedom. People are too ignorant to understand. Well, so many, that was what was going on here. We have this growth of popular ideas that are not necessarily the same as the authors who put them forward. So when Locke talks about, every man has the right to life, liberty, and property, does that mean everybody? For Locke in his world, yeah, because women aren't even a part of it. Neither are our children. Certainly peasants aren't, and the poor aren't. They're completely separate. But if I'm then part of the proletariat, if I'm working within a city, trying to make ends meet, so to speak, and I read this or hear about these ideas of individual rights, I'm going to say I should have individual rights too. That's what's going on. Society is kind of, I'm not going to say in crisis because that becomes that we're always in crisis. In some ways, that's true. but it is kind of like shaking. It is like a constant, seismic shift, and the earthquake hasn't come yet, but it's kind of there. Social tensions based on understandings and the spread of ideas, the spread of information, which too could lead to superstition. Now, I have up here reason, superstition, the individual, and I am aware of the time, and so I'm going to try to abbreviate this. I know your textbook deals with the witch hunts and so, but the point here is that we think of early modern Europe so often as this age of great intellectual growth, the age of reason, so to speak, was still the age of the witch hunts. The 17th century is the great age of the witch hunts. It's still the age of superstition. It's still the age where popular religion is very different from official religion. And this idea of superstition, we look back, oh, how can you think that? It's actually a very rational position to hold, because superstition is rational if we accept the belief that's behind it. If I believe that a black cat walking across my path means bad luck for me, if I believe that, then my avoiding a black cat is a rational act. The same thing with the witches. If I believe that that's possible, then based on that belief, my actions can be rational. So there is a rationality of superstition. There's a rationality of hallucination. If I'm hallucinating something, but based on that, I can act rationally. So we need to put this concept of this age of reason in context, as I tried to do already before, because early modern Europe, to refer to it as an age of reason, is really missing the point. Really missing the point. And it's looking at simply a very narrow top line discussion of the philosophers that then became more widespread with the philosophes, so people who thought themselves to be philosophers. And it's not looking in the context too of the Middle Ages, at least from the 12th century on, as an age of reason, which I talked about previously. It's not that shift that was there. It is really misunderstanding what early modern society and culture was all about. We need to see it more in context and more holistically in terms of what was really going on in early modern Europe, if we're going to understand what was to come as we move and transition from modern Europe or early modern Europe into modern Europe. But that will be for after the midterm. Okay, last slide. Ends, beginnings, and transitions, and on the brink of revolution, the end of early modern Europe. I think that image I had of kind of the earthquake that's about to come. I'm not talking about Lisbon in 1753 that kind of destroyed Voltaire's view of being optimistic about everything. I'm talking about something far more widespread and far more dramatic. Because in the mid-18th century, these ideas are spreading as the problems with the poor and the different variegated classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and still with the urban, the rural poor, the peasants, it is on the verge of explosion. And we'll see those explosions, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and then the Industrial Revolution. Let's talk more about some of this after the midterm. I'll be referring back after the midterm to developments that chronologically are still within early modern Europe, but I haven't gotten to them yet. But I hope this will help set the stage. And in the next lecture for this week, I'll be addressing the midterm explicitly. So don't just ignore it. There will not be a PowerPoint presentation for it. It'll just be lecture 2. But I'll go through with you the midterm, what's expected, how to approach it, what you should know, and hopefully help with you being able to do your very, very best. So that being said, I'll see you shortly. I think I'm going to take a break and try to do that next lecture right now. I mean, not right now, but after I take a break from having done this one. So I'll get back to you with that. And we'll be looking forward to reading your exams. If you have any questions, please just ask. Um, so as we move from this first part of the course into the next part of the course, and I hope I've made some sense and helped. But more on all of this in the next lecture. So thank you so much. Bye bye.